The chair will recognize himself for an opening statement. The United States is the world leader in medical device innovation. According to a recent report, 32 of the 46 medical technology companies with annual sales exceeding $1 billion are based in the United States. And yet, the United States is in danger of losing its preeminent status in this field. Multiple studies have shown that regulatory uncertainty is damaging this critical industry and hurting American patients. For example, the November 2010 study, quote, FDA impact on U.S. medical technology innovation, end quote, surveyed over 200 medical technology companies, and they described the FDA process as, quote, unpredictable and characterized by disruptions and delays, end quote. They also noted that companies are able to make their products available to patients faster and at a significantly lower cost in markets such as Europe. It already is tough for medical device companies. Only 1 out of 4 medtech startups succeed. Half of all reported exits are less than $100 million, and the total pool of available investment capital is shrinking. Quite simply, shorter, more predictable, and more transparent approval processes in Europe have led many device companies to seek a market for their products in Europe before submitting them to the FDA. And they're taking good-paying American jobs overseas with them. In 2008, according to the Lewin Group, the medical device industry employed 422,778 workers nationwide, paid $24.6 billion in earnings, and shipped $135.9 billion worth of products. In 2008, in my home state of Pennsylvania, the medical device industry employed 22,233 people and paid Pennsylvania workers over $1.1 billion in earnings. These are good jobs. Nationally, jobs in medical technology pay almost 40% higher compared to the national earnings average. But this trend does not just hurt our economy. It hurts American patients. American patients, on average, have access to innovative medical devices 2 years later than patients in European countries, and in some cases never have access to these devices. None of us would be concerned about longer, more arduous approval processes for medical devices in the U.S. versus Europe if we thought that those processes kept American patients safer than their European counterparts. But according to recent studies, medical devices marketed through the shorter and more transparent EU processes are statistically as safe as FDA-cleared or approved devices and have comparable patient outcomes. According to a January 2011 Boston Consulting Group report, quote, EU medical devices approval safety assessment, a comparative analysis of medical device recalls 2005-2009, quote, the results of this study suggest little difference between absolute number of serious recalls between the U.S. and EU regulatory systems. The distribution of the serious recalls is similar across therapeutic areas, and reasons for recall suggesting that differences between the two systems do not ultimately affect performance. In addition, given the expectation that the EU approves more devices than the U.S., it is likely that the EU recall rate may actually be slightly lower than the U.S. rate, end quote. We need to ensure that our regulatory system is consistent and transparent so American patients have timely access to life-saving and life-improving drugs and devices, and American workers have access to these goods. I yield the remainder of my time to Chairman Emeritus Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You surprised me, but I do appreciate it. Thank you for holding this hearing. Back in 1997, as the chairman of the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, I had the great privilege to work with Congressman Eshoo on the Medical Device Regulatory Modernization Act of 1997. That became part of the Food and Drug Modernization Act, called FDMA. We work to ensure that the FDA operates in the best interest of patients by ensuring that they have access to new life-enhancing and life-saving technologies. We and others realized that the regulatory process for medical devices needed to be reformed in order to get medical devices to patients in a timelier fashion, to spur medical innovation, and to help drive small business job creation. To date, it appears to me these reforms have been successful. doesn't mean that we can't improve on it. We do not want to backtrack on this success, and we do not want to make it harder on the small businesses and manufacturers to get new and vital medical devices into production and to the market. Texas is a leader in medical device innovation. There are over 4,000 medical equipment and device companies in my state. Most of them are relatively small. Texas and America depend on job creation in this sector with a market that is open and has reasonable regulations. Lack of transparency within the FDA and a drawn-out approval process appear to be hurting these businesses and resulting in job losses. I'm sure our witnesses today are going to comment on that. This is a very good hearing, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you and Chairman Upton for holding it. Look forward to hearing from our witnesses. With that, I would yield to whoever I should yield to.
Yield back to the chair, please. Yeah. Thank you. The chair recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Pallone, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Pitts. I'm pleased that you've scheduled today's hearing on medical devices because I believe we're at an important crossroads. As we continue to work our way out of the recession towards a thriving economy that offers economic opportunities to all Americans, we must out-innovate the rest of the world. America's competitiveness depends on our ability to innovate and keep America number one. However, to do that, we must properly fund key agencies like the FDA that are essential to assisting in the development of new drugs and devices, and I'm disappointed in the cuts proposed by the House Republicans. Research and development has an impact on all sectors of our workforce. I'll use my home state of New Jersey as an example. A new report by Research America noted that New Jersey is the third largest R&D employer in the U.S., with more than 211,000 jobs supported by health R&D, including 50,000 direct jobs in health R&D. The same report shows the economic impact in New Jersey is $60 billion. That said, the government must be responsible for facilitating an environment where Americans can continue to innovate. That's the key to creating new thriving industries that will produce millions of good jobs here at home and a better future for the next generation. If government abandoned its role, we run the real risk of squandering too many opportunities that lead to innovative discoveries and great economic benefits. Now, I've been interested in today's topic of FDA regulation for a long time, and that includes examining where the current system works well and where shortfalls might be. During this time, I've heard from patients, from physicians, and from companies about problems with the 510K process. Physicians and patients are concerned that products aren't fully evaluated before they're allowed on the market, and companies are frustrated at the lack of predictability and transparency in the process. In fact, as chairman of the subcommittee, we held a hearing on these issues in 2009. And during that hearing, we specifically heard about a GAO report on the 510K process, and in particular, on the pre-amendment devices that have never been through the FDA approval process. The FDA is here today, and I hope we can hear about their progress with reviewing the high-risk Class 3 devices that have yet to ever be approved formally. I'm also interested to hear about FDA's recently released innovation initiative because I strongly believe FDA has two very important parts to its mission. First, to make sure that products are safe for U.S. consumers, and second, to facilitate innovation. It's good to see FDA's renewed focus on the latter, and I look forward to the Institute of Medicine's or IOM analysis of some of their recommendations. Let me close by saying that today we'll likely hear about two very different studies that have come to two very different conclusions, each with merit and limitations. In my view, this showcases one more reason why the upcoming IOM report, due out in June, is so critical to this dialogue. I look forward to our witnesses' testimony. I hope that our discussion will inform both Congress and the FDA how to approach these issues in a balanced way, protecting the American consumer while maintaining a strong R&D basis in this country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen, and yields to the chairman, full committee, Mr. Upton, for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing on the impact of medical device regulations on jobs and patients. We do need to get America back to work, and as we talked about on the House floor last week, part of this involves fixing regulatory problems caused by the federal government. Our nation has been the world leader on medical devices, using American innovation to bring life-saving, life-improving devices to American patients and create high-paying, rewarding jobs here at home. In 2008, the medical device industry directly employed over 420,000 Americans. In my home state of Michigan, over 9,000. Unfortunately, our world leadership is being threatened, and as Chairman Pitts outlined so well last week on the House floor, It does appear that a major reason for this is the lack of predictability, certainty, and transparency at FDA. These problems at the FDA are hurting American innovation, costing American jobs, and hurting American patients. According to recent reports and first-hand accounts from our nation's small businesses, device companies are being forced to market their devices first in Europe because the EU countries have predictable and consistent regulatory processes. Because of that, medical devices are available there 2 years ahead of folks here. That's not right. This hearing aims to try and fix that. I yield back my time.
The chair yields to Dr. Burgess. Continue your time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly hear from device manufacturers all across the country about the lack of transparency and an ambiguous and constantly changing approval process that discourages innovation and ultimately does yield to the loss of American jobs. The inability to facilitate a predictable process is causing device manufacturers to move overseas and, most importantly, not allowing patients access to treatments here in the United States that have been found elsewhere. The difficulty by the FDA to ensure a reliable and consistent approval process not only creates a disadvantage for current devices, but it's an inhibitory environment on advances in technology in the future. Earlier this week, Dr. Francis Collins, director of the NIH, came and addressed a few of us at the Health Caucus. He talked about the changes that are occurring with genetic mapping and the new information that is coming online very rapidly. And this whole era of rapid learning can, in fact, lead to a multiplier effect in the development of many interventions that were never before imagined. Investment, yes. Congress does need to make an investment, but also the integration of information is going to be critical in the development of new interventions. And the FDA is the linchpin in all of that. Certainly the National Institute of Health and the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services need to be discussing with each other about future treatments that are going to be necessary and how to integrate those into the payment system. But if the pipeline is not unclogged at the FDA, then many of these new promises are never going to be kept. Now, President Obama talked in the State of the Union address and advocated for America to lead the way in technology and innovation. Unfortunately, his signature health care legislation passed less than a year ago, coupled with the Food and Drug Administration's confusing and sometimes disjointed approval process, has instead encouraged the offshoring of business that has brought medical discoveries to a halt. And let me yield the remaining time to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Lance.
Thank you very much for yielding, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. The medical device industry produces $135 billion in products and employs at least 422,000 residents of this country. In New Jersey, over 20,000 employees in the medical device industry produce nearly $6 billion in products. Many are employed at incubator companies that develop new devices. While the United States remains the leader in innovation in the medical device industry, that place is not set in stone. As the chairman has indicated, a recent study found that the U.S. is slipping as other nations are gaining. Unpredictable, inefficient, and expensive regulatory processes are jeopardizing America's leadership position in medical technology innovation. I look forward to hearing from the panel on ways we can improve the regulatory environment to strengthen our position as the global leader in medical technology. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Chair thanks the gentleman and yields to the ranking member of full committee, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Pitts, for holding this important hearing today. Let me start off with a couple of statements on which I think we all can agree. We all want to ensure that innovation in the medical device industry is vibrant and healthy so that we have access to the best and newest technological advances. We also want the medical devices we use to be as safe as possible and to have every confidence that they're effective. If there are factors that are preventing or inhibiting these things from occurring, we should all be united in doing whatever it takes to reverse these influences. But we cannot have a conversation about innovation and speeding new devices to the market without talking about the importance of ensuring the safety and effectiveness of those devices. So this hearing should be about how we can work together to meet these goals. We will hear today from witnesses invited by the Republicans who will express their concern that the FDA's device regulatory system is inhibiting innovation, depriving patients of new and potentially life-saving devices, and costing Americans jobs. To focus on the other end of the equation, we have also invited two witnesses who will focus on FDA's responsibility to ensure the safety and effectiveness of devices, and we're also fortunate to have the FDA itself here to respond to concerns on both issues. We shouldn't be Democrats on one side of this issue and Republicans on the other. We should all be together and carefully exploring the concerns about the state of innovation of the device industry. It's important we ask some hard questions about the facts and data underlying these assertions. Although Dr. Malkauer's study, for instance, raises some important questions, it is also clear there are some significant limitations to what it tells us about what is actually going on. According to the study itself, it includes a very small portion of the device industry, only 204 out of some 16,000 companies registered with the FDA. It also includes a majority of responses from companies that appear to have had very little previous experience with the FDA's regulatory process. The study asserts that it takes much longer for devices to reach the market as compared to the EU. Obviously, we would all be concerned if that was the case, but we need to make our judgments based on good data. I think there are some real questions about whether Dr. Markauer's study demonstrates that these EU versus U.S. time differentials even exist, and whether Dr. Markauer's study was comparing equivalent measures for times to market. And I'll look forward to hearing from our witnesses on these points. I'll also look forward to hearing from our witnesses about the need to assure that devices are safe and effective when they reach the market. There are countless and often tragic stories of patients injured, even killed by unsafe devices. The study that Dr. Nissen will describe today shows that many devices that were recalled for serious safety reasons were not reviewed by FDA under the more stringent pre-market approval, or PMA, process. That's got to be a concern. We need to ask why so many unsafe devices ultimately harm patients and explore what can be done to prevent injuries in the future. In order to have a flourishing and innovative American device industry that puts safe and effective devices on the market, we need to have a strong and well-resourced FDA. That is in the best interest of American patients, but it is also in the interest of the device industry itself. If patients lose confidence in the FDA, they will lose confidence in industry as well. This is an issue that can and should be bipartisan. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today and to working with my colleagues on this matter. Let me point out, Mr. Chairman, I wasn't aware of the fact that FDA is put in as just one of the members of this panel. I think when anybody's coming to testify from the administration, we have a long tradition of giving them a separate panel, and I know FDA agreed to testify here today. Had I been aware of it, I would have objected because I think this is a very bad precedent. But we'll go along with what has been agreed to for today, but I want it understood that this should be an exception, not the rule. FDA particularly should be the focus of a lot of our inquiry. Is there a culture at FDA where they're slowing things down? Or is it a fact that they don't have enough resources? It's ironic that on the House floor today, we're voting on a budget that will cut FDA, cut a lot of other things, but cut FDA. So it's a little bit insincere when members talk about wanting to get more drugs and devices approved so that the consumers can get the benefits and the innovation, but at the same time we cut FDA to make it more difficult for them to accomplish that goal. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back my time.
Chair, thanks. Gentlemen, there is a vote on the floor, so we will recess until as soon as possible after the last votes, about 10 minutes after the last votes, and we'll reconvene at that time. The committee stands in recess.
Well, that's exactly right. That is. Yeah.
The hearing will reconvene with apologies to our witnesses. We have a panel of 6. Let me introduce the witnesses. Dr. Jeff Shuren is the director of the Food and Drug Administration Center for Devices and Radiological Health. Dr. Josh Mackover is a consulting professor of medicine at Stanford University. He is also the CEO of Exploramed Development and a venture partner at New Enterprise Associates. Mark Deem is the managing partner and chief technology partner of the Foundry. Dr. Rita Redberg is the director of Women's Cardiovascular Services and professor of medicine at the University of California, San Francisco Medical Center. Dr. Steve Nissen is a professor of medicine at the Cleveland Clinic Lerner School of Medicine and chairman of the Department of Cardiovascular Medicine of the Cleveland Clinic Foundation. And Mr. Ralph Hall is a distinguished professor and practitioner of law at the University of Minnesota Law School. Without objection, your written statements will be inserted into the record. We'll ask the witnesses to summarize their testimony into 5 minutes. And at this time, we will recognize Dr. Shuren for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, I'm Dr. Jeff Shuren, Director of the Center for Devices and Radiological Health at the Food and Drug Administration, and thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Over the past decade, most indicators of medical device industry success have gone steadily upwards. From 2005 to 2009, the industry has added over 45,000 jobs, according to U.S. Census data. It is one of the few U.S. manufacturing segments with a positive trade balance. And especially crucial indicators the attractiveness of an industry to capital investors and entrepreneurs. In 2010, the medical device industry was 4th in attracting venture capital investment, up from 13th place 10 years ago. Although the medical device industry has weathered the recession far better than most of our industries, the economic climate has had an impact, with some companies choosing to move overseas. And as recent reports note, the recession has also caused companies to change their business models to be more risk-averse and therefore more sensitive to FDA regulatory uncertainties. We recognize that smart FDA regulation is critical to maintain U.S. competitiveness. Some would say that despite the record of growth and prosperity in the U.S. device industry, the European regulatory system is better for industry and patients. It is difficult to make direct comparisons between the U.S. and European systems given their fundamental differences, including at the most basic level differing approval standards. The EU lacks the requirement in U.S. law that a device be shown effective. Device manufacturers in Europe select from a list of private companies for safety reviews and pay the chosen company for that review. The result is a European review process that does not have adequate public accountability, consistency, and transparency, and is thus almost impossible to compare directly with FDA's. This is in part why the European Commission has proposed that the EU regulatory framework be strengthened to better meet European public health expectations and to make European industry more competitive globally. Our data reported to this committee just last week shows that, in fact, FDA's device review performance has been consistently strong, and even an industry-funded study released just today shows we are beating the Europeans in the review time for lower risk and are in a tie for higher risk 510K devices. Perhaps the more important consideration vis-a-vis Europe, however, is our comparative safety records. As a recent industry-funded study points out, the absence of a centralized public database that captures all EU recalls and approvals makes it impossible to accurately compare recall rates in the EU and the US. And yet that study shows that 85% of safety reports come from only 5 out of the 24 European countries examined, suggesting there is a significant underreporting of safety problems by some EU countries. In addition, that same study claims that both devices come on the market earlier in the EU and that recalls of specific devices in the EU and US tend to occur within a few weeks of each other. If that were true, it suggests that the EU takes longer to identify problems, exposing patients there to unsafe devices for a longer period of time. In just the past few months, a surgical sealant and a form of breast implants were determined to be dangerous and pulled from the market after being approved under the EU system and used in thousands of patients. The result was surgical removal and patient suffering. Neither of these products were sold in the U.S. Previously, other devices approved in Europe but not in the U.S. were pulled from the European market due to safety problems. In some cases, problems first identified in studies required by the FDA to support approval for U.S. patients. If those products had been approved here, I have no doubt we would be having a different hearing today. FDA has a responsibility to facilitate device innovation while assuring that devices are safe and effective. The comprehensive reports we released in August of last year showed that we have not done as good a job managing our pre-market review programs as we should. We have new reviewers who need better training. We need to improve management oversight and standard operating procedures. We need to provide greater clarity for our staff and for industry about key parts of the 510K program. We need to provide greater clarity for industry about what we need from them to facilitate more efficient, predictable reviews. We need to find the means to handle the ever-increasing workload and reduce staff and manager turnover, which is almost double that in the drug and biologics centers. We need to meet all of these challenges to improve predictability, consistency, and transparency in pre-market review programs. In January this year, after extensive public input, we announced 25 specific actions we are taking this year to ensure that our pre-market review programs both foster innovation and assure the safety and efficacy of medical devices for American patients. And just last week, Commissioner Hamburg and I proposed the Innovation Initiative to accelerate the development and evaluation of innovative medical devices and strengthen the nation's research infrastructure for developing breakthrough technologies and advancing regulatory science. Mr. Chairman, I commend the subcommittee's efforts, and I'm pleased to answer any questions the subcommittee may have.
Chair thanks the gentleman and recognizes Dr. Mockauer for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Pitts, Ranking Member Pallone, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Josh Mockauer, and I've dedicated the past 22 years of my life to developing therapies and technologies to improve patient care. Over this time, I've founded 6 independent medical device companies which have created several hundred jobs and touched the lives of hundreds of thousands of patients worldwide. In addition to being a physician, inventor, and entrepreneur, I co-founded the Stanford Biodesign Innovation Program to teach the process of medical innovation to the next generation of innovators. I'm here today because I'm deeply concerned that we are in jeopardy of losing U.S. leadership position in medical technology innovation as a result of the current regulatory environment at FDA. Over the past few years, it's been increasingly more difficult, more time-consuming, more costly, and less predictable to navigate the FDA. As a result, investment is drying up, companies are moving overseas or closing their doors, and U.S. patients are being denied timely access to safe and effective new medical products. If this situation does not improve immediately, a generation of innovation and businesses will be lost, along with the jobs they would have created and the lives they would have saved or improved. These are not my concerns alone. Numerous studies and reports over the past year document the difficulty innovators are having navigating the FDA. In response to questions from members of Congress and FDA officials regarding the scope of the problems, I, along with several colleagues from Stanford, conducted a survey of over 200 medical technology companies to generate data on their specific experiences. So much of what has become policy over the past few years has been based on anecdote and singular examples, and I felt compelled to bring data to this discussion. It is essential we use data to drive our decision-making. Recognizing that all studies have limitations, mine is no different. However, the results of my study are compelling and justifiably cannot be ignored or dismissed. I have submitted the results of the full survey as part of my testimony, but want to briefly point out some of the most significant findings. Most notably, the survey found that on average, innovative new medical devices are available to U.S. citizens 2 full years later than patients in other countries. In some cases, American patients wait as long as 6 years, longer than patients elsewhere for American-made technologies. This hurts patient health and U.S. competitiveness. There is no other way to say this. Today, American innovation, investment, and manufacturing in medical technologies are leaving this country and landing in Europe, Asia, and elsewhere first. These findings don't only have negative repercussions for patients, they hurt job creation in this country. The most innovative products being designed today are really made by small and mid-sized companies. These are the very innovators that both the President and Congress have called upon to lead us out of our economic challenges, but they are starving for funding and they are running out of time. They are being crushed with overly burdensome regulation, and now with the medical device tax, they're being taxed before they ever become profitable. This is wrong, and we cannot let it continue. We all know we need an FDA. Their mission to protect and promote the public health is a good one. We all want products that have a reasonable assurance of safety and efficacy. But we cannot make the process so difficult or so costly that we kill the very innovation we depend upon to advance the public health, the very innovation we depend upon to advance our economy. Today, unfortunately, this industry is at a crossroads. Driven by high-profile anecdotes and a fear of making a mistake, our FDA has become more risk-averse while becoming less predictable, less reasonable than at any time in our history. My colleagues and I, who have spent our careers focused on patient care, are now seeing foreign patients reaping the benefits of American ingenuity first before Americans ever get a chance to. We're seeing jobs move overseas, and worse, we're seeing yet another one of America's great industries brought to its knees, struggling to survive under a system we created. Let's work together to make sure that American patients and workers reap the benefits of these amazing medical advancements first. Let's work together to provide a predictable and reasonable regulatory environment for our nation's medtech entrepreneurs. And let's make sure that the generation of innovation is not lost forever. We owe this to the pioneering medical innovators who came before us, to our students and the innovators of the future, to the men and women whose jobs rely upon us, and most importantly, to the patients who depend upon us for their survival and their quality of life. Thank you.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Recognizes Mr. Deem for 5 minutes.
Chairman Pitts, Ranking Member Pallone, the subcommittee, thank you for having me here today. My name is Mark Deem, a biomedical engineer by training. I've spent 23 years in medical device research and development. Today, I'm a partner in a medical device incubator called The Foundry. Our job is to partner with physicians to investigate unmet clinical needs and to invent and develop technologies to create superior patient outcomes. Over the past 12 years, we have founded, funded, staffed, and run 14 startups. We've raised over $700 million in venture capital. We're inventors on over 250 issued and pending U.S. patents, and we've employed over 500 people. Because of these startups, patients who 10 years ago would have had major open-heart surgery for cardiac valve disease can now undergo a 1-hour catheter-based procedure to have their valve repaired. Patients who would have been sent to a rehab facility after suffering a stroke to simply hope for the best can now have the blood clot responsible for that stroke removed using a tiny device threaded through their arteries. Patients with drug-resistant hypertension can undergo a 30-minute procedure that lowers their blood pressure by 3 to 5 times what drugs can achieve. Startups are responsible for a huge percentage of the paradigm-shifting breakthroughs in medical care. We are the most fragile end of the medical device ecosystem, and we are struggling. Over the last 2 years, funding for new startups has dropped by almost 50%, down from 118 new companies in 2008 to 60 in 2010. Delays and unpredictability at the FDA are one of the primary risk factors impacting this investment. Over a similar time period, the average time to PMA approval increased by 75%, and many of those companies never get there at all. In 2000, we founded Emphasis Medical to convert an extremely morbid open chest surgery to treat emphysema to a non-invasive scope-based procedure. 8 years and over $75 million of investment, having met the clinical trial endpoints, the FDA denied approval for the therapy and recommended continuing on to new studies. In the face of these moving targets, the board voted to shut the company down in 2009. 40 employees lost their jobs and the assets were sold at auction. The technology continues to treat patients overseas safely and effectively today. Also in 2000, we started a company named Satiety to develop a non-invasive scope-based technology to reduce stomach volume and to treat morbid obesity and diabetes. 10 years and over $80 million of investment later, having met the trial endpoint, but while still collecting long-term follow-up, we learned that the FDA was holding companies to a different standard than the ongoing study was constructed to demonstrate. Given past experience, the writing was on the wall for a request for new studies. Just before Christmas of 2010, 37 entrepreneurs lost their jobs as we shut that company down as well. Today, it is also harder than ever to even get a trial started in the U.S. In 2002, we started Xstent to develop a next-generation drug-eluting stent. Starting in 2004, we worked with the agency to plan a trial, finally submitting an IDE in 2007. For 2 years, the agency requested more and more data, ultimately requiring an animal study in pigs with 2-year follow-up. At the time, Xstent had data from European studies with 1-year follow-up on 220 patients, 2-year follow-up on 100 patients, and 3-year follow-up on 30 patients. While certainly nobody would consider using U.S. patients as guinea pigs, there is no justification for ignoring that kind of data. Could 20 pigs in Michigan really provide more significant data than hundreds of patients in Europe? Finally, in May 2009, conditional IDE approval was granted to Xstent, but by then the company was out of money and was being sold at auction. Over 200 people lost their jobs. Today, development of that technology continues in China and Switzerland. Experiences like these have led us to fundamentally rethink how we operate. Given the relative stability and predictability of the CE system, we are no longer structuring our companies for first commercial release in the U.S. We develop our products here and then run the same large multi-center randomized trial overseas that we would have conducted in the U.S. We then commercialize in the EU while we decide when and if to approach the FDA. As a result, as you've heard, the availability of new therapies in the U.S. can lag the EU by up to 4 years. We recognize the challenges facing the FDA, and we do value its mission to protect and preserve public health. But we need consistency and clarity to help the FDA achieve its other mission of fostering innovation. A recent study by the Boston Consulting Group shows that the EU safety record is essentially identical to that of the U.S. So, if we are not increasing safety, why should we be satisfied with a system that is driving investment, innovation, and jobs overseas? Why should we be satisfied with a system where U.S. patients wait 4 years longer for access to care that was pioneered in the U.S.? Because the sad fact is many of those patients simply will not live that long.
Chair thanks the gentleman and recognizes Dr. Redberg for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Pitts, Chairman Upton, Ranking Member Pallone, Ranking Member Waxman, and other distinguished members of the subcommittee for this invitation to present some of our work on medical devices. I'm Rita Redberg. I'm a professor of medicine and full-time faculty at the University of California, San Francisco Medical Center in the Division of Cardiology. I'm also the chief editor of the Archives of Internal Medicine, a well-respected, peer-reviewed medical journal which publishes much research in the area of internal medicine as well as in medical devices. I was a Robert Wood Johnson Health Policy Fellow in the Office of Senator Orrin Hatch, and I am currently a member of the FDA Cardiovascular Devices Expert Panel as well as the California Technology Assessment Forum. As a practicing cardiologist, I'm very grateful for the advances in medical technology that have allowed me to take better care of my patients every day. However, I have great concerns that many high-risk devices that are reaching the market today are doing so without the benefits of clinical trials, which are essential to assure safety and effectiveness for my patients. Although the 510(k) process was logical and well-intentioned when introduced in 1976, it has in no way kept up with the increased number and complexity of medical devices now available today, particularly in my own field of cardiology as well as in orthopedics. Unfortunately, although a new device sounds very exciting and glamorous, it cannot be said to be innovative unless it's been shown in a well-done clinical trial to have actual benefit for patients. No matter how innovative a device is, if it is not showing benefit for patients, it is not, I won't consider it innovative, and it can't be considered to be beneficial. Unfortunately, we now have a process where more high-risk devices are going through a 510(k) clearance than are going through the original PMA process. The GAO report in 2009 entitled FDA Should Take Steps to Ensure That High-Risk Device Types Are Approved Through the Most Stringent Pre-Market Review Process found that less than 1% of all new devices go through the PMA process. That was not the intent of Congress, and at the time, FDA resolved to either reclassify these high-risk devices to a lower risk class or to go through an original pre-market approval process. Fortunately, that has not yet happened. I want to give you one example of the inferior vena cava filter. This was published in the Archives of Internal Medicine. There are the Bard Recovery inferior vena cava filter and G2 device were approved by the FDA pursuant to 510(k) process. Filter is an umbrella-like device that's put in the main vein in the heart in order to trap clots. This device was investigated by surgeons, including Dr. William Nicholson and colleagues in Pennsylvania, because they noted that several patients of theirs who had this device were coming back in with severe chest pain and shortness of breath. Upon investigation, they discovered that this device was fracturing and moving to other parts of the body, including the heart, causing puncture of the heart and severe complications. These doctors took it upon themselves to investigate all of the patients at their hospital that had received this device over the last 5 years and found that fully 1 in 4 of one type and 1 in 8 of the other type of this filter had fractures. They published these findings as well as notified the FDA. In my own research on this device, I was shocked to discover that this clearly high-risk implanted device had gone through FDA 510K clearance without benefit of any clinical trial data. And in fact, there is no randomized data to show us that inferior vena cava filters are superior to other methods for treatment of blood clots and prevention of recurrent pulmonary emboli. The FDA, on the day we published these studies on August 9th last year, issued a warning reminding physicians to retrieve these filters because they were meant to be put in and then removed. However, less than 7% of all these filters are currently retrieved. When I investigated on why the FDA waited 5 years and 921 adverse events to release this warning, I learned that the FDA did not know there were so many serious adverse events because, unfortunately, the computer systems available are arcane and don't allow for real-time monitoring. And so I think that in order for the FDA to fulfill its mission of protecting the public safety, the FDA needs increased resources and staffing. We heard that the medical device industry is $135 billion a year in products that are currently covered by Medicare as well as private insurance. In contrast, the Center for Devices and CDRH receives a small budget of $272 million to do all of the pre-marketing as well as post-marketing surveillance of this huge device industry. So I think to allow the FDA to fulfill its mission to ensure safety and effectiveness, and that includes adequate pre-marketing and post-marketing data, we need to give the FDA adequate resources to do so. Thank you so much.
Chair thanks the gentlelady and recognizes Dr. Neeson for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Stephen E. Nissen, MD. I am chairman of the Department of Cardiovascular Medicine at the Cleveland Clinic. My testimony does not reflect the views of the Cleveland Clinic. I agree with the underlying premise of these hearings. For decades, the American medical products industry has been responsible for innovations that have saved lives, reduced suffering, and sometimes even lowered medical costs. I also agree that this industry creates high-quality jobs that contribute to the nation's economic health. The dilemma posed by today's hearings is how to best promote innovation while protecting the health of the American people. Medical devices are regulated via an antiquated regulatory system originally devised in 1976 that employs two very different pathways to market. Pre-market approval is a rigorous standard similar to the approach used to regulate pharmaceutical products. The 510K provision allows products to be cleared for market if they are deemed substantially equivalent to devices already marketed, many before 1976. Surprisingly, 35 years later, the 510K pathway is now used for 98% of all medical devices. 510K cleared devices rarely undergo any testing in patients, and manufacturing facilities are not subject to FDA inspections. Often, new devices are very dissimilar to previously marketed medical products, use different materials and manufacturing processes, and have different intended uses. The abbreviated 510K process was never intended for Class 3 medical devices, products used for life-supporting or life-sustaining indications. However, FDA has sometimes cleared such devices for market using the 510K provision, a policy that was sharply criticized by the GAO in a 2009 report. In recent years, several high-profile withdrawals of medical devices have resulted in serious injuries or death. In a particularly poignant example, a faulty lead used in an implantable defibrillator frequently failed, resulting in inappropriate shocks or worse, a failure to function during a cardiac arrest resulting in death. When this problem was identified, patients were presented with an agonizing choice: to undergo operation to remove the defective device or take their chances that it wouldn't fail when needed to save their life. An artificial hip joint used in 13,000 patients failed rapidly, often releasing toxic metal debris which sickened thousands of patients. Again, patients faced the choice of a painful and risky operation or accepting the possibility of serious health consequences. We recently analyzed all 113 high-risk medical device recalls from 2005 to 2009 of products FDA deemed could cause serious injury or death. Surprisingly, 71% of these high-risk recalls involved devices initially cleared using the 510K process. Only 19% had undergone full PMA approval. This finding represents a paradox. If, by federal regulations, high-risk devices should not be cleared using the 510K provision, there should almost never be recalls of such devices for life-threatening defects. The total number of devices recalled in this interval exceeded 112 million. According to FDA data, more than 2,000 deaths are reported each year from failure of medical devices, rising to nearly 5,000 in 2009. These statistics illustrate the need for a balanced approach to medical device regulation. Although we all want to stimulate innovation and job creation, we cannot allow deregulation to place the American public at risk for serious health consequences from defective products. A more nuanced approach to device regulation would appropriately balance the need for timely approval with patient safety. Components of reform should include a more accurate definition of a high-risk device, which takes into account the likely risks if the device is defective, an intermediate regulatory category more rigorous than 510K, but short of a full PMA process for moderate-risk devices, and, very importantly, better funding for the FDA Center for Devices to enable timely but thorough evaluation of the risks and benefits of medical devices. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear here today.
Chair thanks the gentleman and recognizes Mr. Hall for 5 minutes.
Chairman Pitts, Ranking Member Pallone, members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to appear today and to discuss with you the 510K system in general and specifically some research I've done into the safety profile of devices cleared via that process. I serve on the faculty at the University of Minnesota Law School, where I teach in the food and drug law area and concentrate my writing and my research in that area. In addition, I work part-time with the law firm of Baker & Daniels, counseling firms in FDA matters, and with 3 other individuals, we have formed a startup medical device company called MR3 Medical. Going back several years when the debate over the 510K system began, I observed that the debate was taking place with little data. There was a lot of anecdote, a lot of individual events that people were discussing. And at a meeting, public meeting about a year ago, I commented we were involved in a ready, fire, aim situation. And therefore, I conducted a study, the first of its kind, I believe, to try to assess the safety profile of 510K products. This was funded by the Kauffman Foundation out of Kansas City. I was given total academic freedom. It should be clear that I'm speaking in my individual capacity, not on behalf of any entity, particularly the University of Minnesota. In this study, we analyzed Class 1 or high-risk recalls, these over a 5-year time period. We coded these for a number of factors, including the reason for the recall. We think that's critical because you need to identify events, recalls, then the cause of that in order to identify what can be done to address it. The results of this is we had 118 Class 1 recalls, 112 of which were relevant. The other 6 involved counterfeit products, things like that. Of these, 89 involve 510K products. This has to take into account the number of 510K submissions during the time frame. You can't simply look at the numerator. During the same time frame, the best estimates are there are over 19,000 510K submissions. What that means is, from a safety perspective, greater than 99.5% of all 510K submissions did not result in a Class 1 recall during the study period. We then further delved into the data and identified which reasons for the recall related to post-market issues as compared to pre-market issues. Obviously, an issue that happens 5 years after the product is approved or cleared because of a labeling mistake or whatever is not accountable to the approval process. And it turns out that less than half of all recalls relate to issues that could have been involved pre-market activities. We further analyzed the data, looking at the reasons for the recall, and less than 9% of all recalls involved issues other than quality system issues. What this indicates to us is the system as a whole, from a safety perspective, is operating very well. Can we do better? Of course. Do we need to do better? Of course. To help with that effort, then, we did a sub-analysis even further by type of device. And we identified the concentration of recalls in automatic external defibrillators and infusion pumps, 28% of all recalls. Interestingly, the agency has now commenced 2 initiatives on those products. From our perspective, that's the right way to approach this. Identify the issue and address the specific issues. The information I'm talking about has been presented to the IOM, reviewed with FDA and other stakeholders. So what does our study then conclude? FDA has an excellent safety record in the 510K program. Improvements can be made. We need to strive for improvements. We need to always concentrate on the risk-benefit analysis, and the most effective way to improve the safety profile of products is to increase and further emphasis on quality systems as compared to pre-market products. Stated differently, changing the pre-market clearance process based upon our data will have a minimal effect on reducing the number of recalls. Therefore, our conclusion is that the focus should be on quality systems as the primary way to improve the safety of products for the U.S. public. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Thanks all the witnesses for your testimony, and we'll go to questions at this time. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes for questioning. We've heard a lot of discussion today on the medical device approval process used by the FDA. Mr. Hall, your study focused on recalls of medical devices approved through the 510K and the PMA process. Based on your research into the recalls, is FDA clearing unsafe products?
In my study, FDA has an excellent record in approval of products with a greater than 99.5% of products not experiencing a recall.
Could you comment, please, on the study published this week in the Archives of Internal Medicine? How did those study authors end up with recall results that are much higher than what your study found? And can you comment on the methodology used in the Archives of Internal Medicine study?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. The data that was used by both studies ended up with very similar numbers for what I call the numerator. I had 118 Class 1 recalls. I believe they had 112 or 113, something like that. Where the differences are is that we also went beyond just looking at the number of absolute recalls, but looked at the percentage of that compared to the number of submissions. If my daughter comes home and got 80 wrong out of 150, which is the number of PMAs, excuse me, that's a problem. But in the 510K world, there are over 19,000. So we're talking about, in their study, 80, in my study, 89 recalls out of over 19,000. We also looked at the reason for the recall. That's critical to understand what to focus on. Next, there is a confusion about comparing high-risk devices for approval process for high-risk devices for recall. Those are very different things. And it's important the committee understand that. The classification for an approval is the risk for the intended use. The recall is the risk to the patient for the malfunction. And let me give you a very simple example. A tongue depressor. No one would consider a tongue depressor to be high risk or needs a clinical study. But if the tongue depressor gets contaminated with a deadly bacteria, the recall for that tongue depressor should be a high-risk recall. And so you cannot link the approval classification with the recall. Final comment, I'm a lawyer, I'm a law school professor. At a different environment we should talk about. There are a number of statements about the law in the article which I think need to be corrected.
Thank you. Dr. Makauer, in your work you find that companies spend $31 million to bring low-risk devices to market, and of that amount, $24 million is spent navigating the FDA approval process. Your findings for bringing higher-risk devices to market are even more staggering. Companies must spend $94 million, spending $75 million navigating the FDA approval process. Can you break down the investments that a typical company might make to help them navigate the FDA? How feasible is it for a small company to come up with appropriate funding to navigate the process at the FDA?
Quite honestly, these are figures that are exceeding venture capital's ability to fund startups to these levels, and thus that is why we are seeing a decrease in the number of startups, because people don't want to take that big financial risk for getting these products all the way to market, and with those costs increasing, that capital is just not available.
Mr. Deem, would you care to comment on that too? Have any of your companies closed because of the expense involved in navigating the FDA process?
Each of the three examples that I gave today at the end of the day ended up shutting the doors because it was the judgment of the board of directors that further investment to continue through the regulatory process, given the barriers that they had already hit and the moving milestones that they were being asked to hit, the further investment was just not justified. So it wasn't that we didn't think that ultimately we could get through the process. We thought perhaps eventually we could get through. But given the moving goalposts involved, the extra investment was not justified and the companies were shut down.
One final question, Dr. Machauer. According to your work, device approval times in the U.S. are much longer in the U.S. compared to Europe, and you find that those companies who spoke with the FDA about conducting a clinical study for their low to moderate risk device before making a regulatory submission, the pre-market process took an average of 31 months from first communication to being cleared to market the device. In contrast, the equivalent process in Europe took an average of 7 months. And the higher risk devices seeking pre-market approval, companies indicate took an average of 54 months to work with FDA from first communications to being approved to market device. In Europe, it was 11 months. Did your study identify any reasons as to why there's such a discrepancy in approval times?
The major difference is that in Europe, a study run by high-quality investigators that makes clinical sense to specialists in the field are generally accepted as data for approval. And there isn't a lengthy negotiation over endpoints or study design that usually happens in the United States. Whereas in the United States, that process, even just the process of obtaining an IDE, which is the approval necessary to do a study in the United States, that can take years. And so that alone is a reason why the two systems are different.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the ranking member for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to ask Dr. Shuren a question, but before I do, I just want to say I think it's important that when we talk about innovation, which is what I talked about in my opening, and of course the President talks about it constantly, that when we talk about innovation, we talk about safety and effectiveness of devices at the same time, because innovation in devices can generate positive changes in the health of all Americans, but only if we can properly ensure the safety of those devices. But navigating the FDA process, shouldn't be unpredictable, and it shouldn't be unreasonably long. So I was a little stunned to hear Dr. Maker's finding that it's 2 years longer for approval in the U.S. as compared to Europe for low and moderate risk devices, and 3.5 years longer for higher risk devices. I wanted to ask Dr. Shuren, you run the center responsible for these approval times, and I find these numbers outrageous, this difference between U.S. and Europe. How's that possible? What's the situation?
I don't think, with all due respect to Josh, I don't think the study is an accurate reflection of what's going on now. And putting aside the very low reporting in this survey, which means it's going to be biased to the most dissatisfied, if you actually look at the data on PMAs and this long time between us for approval and the EU, the time frames of 54 months versus 11 months. In the U.S., you can come talk to us before you've designed a clinical trial. You can talk to us about what the data needs are, then develop the clinical trial. Regardless, you're going to come in at the time you're going to do a clinical trial. If you apply that here for the EU, look at the 11 months. It means you'd come in to talk. You'd develop a clinical protocol, you'd set up your study, you'd enroll your patients, you conduct the study, you collect your data, you analyze it, you put together a submission, you send it to the private company who reviews it, and they make a decision. In 11 months? That means a clinical study of 4 weeks. This is comparing apples and oranges. This is comparing when you come in to talk to us as opposed to review times. If you actually go ahead...
I'm going to have to interrupt because I got to get my other questions in here. I was heartened to hear President Obama's comments at the State of Union address about how the U.S. needs to win the future and promote innovation. I keep talking about it. In my own state, we have a serious life science industry, and I know that FDA also places a high importance on promoting innovation. But you mentioned something in your testimony about the steps you have implemented to promote innovation. Can you tell us about that? What you're exactly doing to promote innovation?
Certainly. Well, starting with even the actions we're taking under our 510K improvement plan is about increasing predictability, consistency, and transparency through guidance, through training, through administrative changes to make sure greater management oversight and decision-making, even leveraging experts outside of the agency to better inform us on tough scientific questions. But we also announced an innovation initiative creating what we call an innovation pathway. It's a paradigm shift in how we approach breakthrough technologies in which we forward push our resources. We front load them so we're involved early on and we can address some of these tough scientific questions early on, and we think under that program we can cut our review time in half.
Thank you. Let me just ask you one more thing. I want to ask about resources. Dr. Shuren, as I'm sure you're aware, the House Republicans have put forward a continuing resolution that would slash the FDA's budget by 10%. And these are cuts on top of what is already an underfunded agency, in my opinion. If these drastic cuts were to be passed into law, will you have the resources to support new initiatives like this innovation pathway? And how would these cuts affect your ability to make clearances and approvals more timely and practical?
Well, the innovation pathway would be a non-option. And for the rest of what we do, this would result in increased delays in decisions. It would deny patients truly safe and effective innovative technologies, and it will result in jobs being lost.
Well, I'm just going to go down the panel. Let me just ask, and I got a minute left. Does anyone on this panel think that drastic cuts to FDA make much sense right now? Start, obviously, Dr. Shuren. Doesn't Dr. Makeover?
Drastic cuts to, sorry.
Well, you could say yes or no if you want. Or do you think the drastic cuts, the cuts we're talking about, make sense now?
I'm not sure.
All right, Mr. Dean.
I haven't looked closely at the situation. Obviously, I'd need to look at the efficiencies that are involved in the process as well as the overall number.
Okay, Dr. Redburn.
I think substantial investment is required for the FDA. It needs to, for resources and staffing, as well as the entire electronic infrastructure, so that it can actually do pre-marketing and post-marketing surveillance as it would like to.
Thank you. Dr. Neeson, yes or no?
No.
Mr. Hall.
I think if that's what the Congress decides, the agency is capable of meeting its statutory and public health requirements.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure. Thanks, the gentleman. And yields to Dr. Burgess for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, of course, funding for the FDA, just to pick up on Mr. Pallone's point, has been an issue that this committee has looked at for the 6 years that I've been on the committee prior to this term. We have increased the authorization for FDA spending on multiple occasions, but with both Republican and Democratic appropriators, those funding levels have not been met. So it's all well and good to criticize the process that's going on today. It is a process that was left over from last year. It's unfortunate it looks the way it does, but I really appreciate Mr. Hall's comments. It is up to us to provide the funding. It is up to the administrator at the FDA to get the job done with the tools at hand. Why would you pay more for what you're getting? Do we want more of this? How far away from desirable do we care to be? And this is really what's driving a lot of this discussion today. It appears that the average 510K decision has risen almost 20% from 2002 to 2008, 97 days in 2002, 116 days in 2008. The director recently released a letter emphasizing just as you reiterated this morning, the FDA's dedication to increasing predictability, reliability, efficiency, and transparency of the regulatory pathways, all good things. Last year, when I was on another subcommittee, I wrote to you with my concerns that you were, in fact, altering the processes, but doing so independently without consulting Congress. So I will reiterate the question I asked you in a letter last summer. How specifically does the FDA plan to do this? And why did you undertake those efforts with the IOM study still not completed?
So what we plan to do is a series of actions that we announced. And when we put together these reports, and we undertook these reports in part because of concerns that were raised by industry and also concerns that were raised by consumer and patient groups. And we went out and we conducted comprehensive outreach. We had 2 public meetings, 3 public dockets, 3 town hall meetings. We put out 2 reports, 55 recommendations in the summer, and we asked for public comment on that. We came and we briefed staff on the Hill both before and after we went out with our actions just a few weeks ago. Those 25 actions are based around greater clarity through guidance about the 510K program, about when to submit clinical data, about fixing what's called the de novo process. It's the process for the lower risk innovative devices because it's been broken for years and it needs to be fixed. Better training for my staff. I rolled in, we did not have core competencies. We are now putting in place core competency training with certifications.
Let me stop you there, and perhaps we can get some of this accomplished in a written exchange that I had asked for last summer. Dr. Redberg emphasized the lack of effective electronic capability of handling the data, the infrastructure, the architecture for the information technology. How are you doing with that? You have been given additional funds over the last 3 years. Are you there yet? Are you getting there? Have you been able to digitize your data in the not just the new drug application, not just the device application, but throughout the agency?
I can't speak for throughout the agency, but we are moving forward. We have made progress for setting up the new database for adverse event reporting.
But we kind of hear that every year. And are you there yet?
We're not there yet.
And give us a reasonable expectation of when that might happen.
We're expecting to have the first prototype up this year. We will also be coming out this year with the unique device identification regulation, too. And that's going to be critical for linking a device with the clinical experience with that device we don't have right now.
And an excellent idea, and I think one that we've heard before, is just we're all anxious for that to happen because, as I indicated in my opening statement, there are going to be real challenges for the researchers at NIH, Don Berwick and his crew at CMS being able to implement those new tools that they're given by NIH, and you guys stand in the middle. So you're either going to be the facilitator or the bottleneck, and I just pray that you're going to take that facilitator role very, very seriously. Let me just ask you one other question that it came up. I think it was Mr. Deemer, perhaps it was Dr. Macauer that brought it up. Newsweek article on the race to grow new organs, and organs being grown on scaffolding with the patient's own cells. There was a doctor, Anthony Atala in North Carolina, growing new body parts for a particular type of difficulty that children could be born with. And as a consequence, he received, I guess, an emergency designation to do this in 7 or 8 or 9 patients from the FDA. Showed some great results, of course, no rejection because it was patient's own cells. Vascularization occurred after these devices were implanted. And then you got back to him and said, well, we'll have to show it works in animals. I mean, this is the kind of crazy stuff that just drives people nuts. You've got a small series of 7 to 10 patients where it's working, and you tell this guy, go back to square one, spend another $5 million, and let's prove this will work in dogs before we do it in any more people. That's why it goes to Europe. That's why it goes to Europe.
We'll look at it, but this may actually involve the other center, the Center for Biologics. But we do take it very seriously. And I will tell you, I am new at the helm a little bit over a year. And I will tell you, during that time, we have been making some important changes. And our performance, and you did ask before, our performance actually has been improving. And that 510K time, actually for us, we've been doing very well. What we have found, though, is that the times are going up because industry isn't pulling its fair share. it's been sending us poor quality submissions. We've been seeing poor clinical studies. And we meet with these companies, and they like to meet with us, and they're ignoring our recommendations in terms of what to do. If we're going to fix this, FDA needs to make changes. And we made a commitment to do that, and we're moving forward on them. But we also need industry to be held responsible, too, for its failures, for the things that we cannot control.
Mr. Chairman, can I just ask unanimous consent that industry be allowed to respond? Dr. Mackauer and Mr. Deem are sitting right there.
Without objection, so ordered.
I think the issue is what is reasonable, and that's what this comes down to. And I think you pointed out an example of exactly the type of thing that frustrates industry. We're trying to help patients, and we're trying to bring therapy forward. And sometimes the requests and requirements, the reason why we can't get agreement on a clinical trial protocol is because what is being asked may and sometimes be extraordinary beyond what is a reasonable requirement, and sometimes what is impossible, where you have an early stage technology, it must evolve. And so we are depriving physicians, patients the opportunity to get access to these things earlier, and that's the net impact. Is that disagreement, that time frame, is what's really delaying innovation reaching patients.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen, and yields recognizes gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, if you don't keep a hold on Burgess, he'll just consume the whole time. So I learned that as ranking member last Congress. So he's very impassioned, and we appreciate his commitment. Let's just talk. The nation sent a new Congress here to deal with the national debt, the deficit, and job creation. The hearings that we've had here in the committee is really focusing on how do we create jobs without spending money. And the answer is we have to ease the regulatory burdens. The agencies aren't going to get any more money. So you can ask all you want, there's no more money. So if you have demands of what you have to do, you have to talk to us and say, you put this demand on us, which we have, part of it's our problem, say, this is really a stupid thing we shouldn't be doing. And if we jettison this, that'll free up money to do what we really need to do. So, I reject this argument that you all need more money. Just like people at home, just like businesses who are in lean times, they have to make difficult decisions to get back to core competencies. And I think there's an argument, especially in this, that we're slowing the process down so much. In some of these devices, it's nonsensical and it hurts job creation. I've got a couple questions that I want to talk about. In October, at that time I was ranking member of the Health of this subcommittee. I joined 11 of my colleagues in sending a letter to FDA on the 501k reform changes. In that letter, we asked FDA for an economic analysis of those changes so we could know if it would hurt American job creation. Dr. Shuren, if you can give me a yes or no answer, did you provide that economic analysis?
No.
Thank you. That's typical of federal agencies that I've been dealing with the last couple weeks. Mr. Mackauer and Mr. Dean, since the FDA didn't provide it, let me ask you, what could be the economic impact of these changes on American device companies?
These changes being?
The 501k.
The changes. Many of them are things that make sense, and actually I don't really think even need much approval. However, there are several changes that are being proposed that could have a devastating impact on our ability to bring...
Quickly, give me a couple examples.
One example is kind of the definition of what is an intended use. And depending on how that is characterized, if that is characterized in one way versus another, it may require companies to study not only the intended use that they're actually pursuing to get a label on, but all other possible indications that doctors might use it on, which would delay access for and would probably prevent many technologies from reaching the market.
Mr. Deem, can I ask you, can you follow the question? You got a response?
Sure. I think we're also concerned and watching closely what's going to happen with the designation of a Class 2B and requirements and guidances for clinical study that will come out of that, and that's still yet to be determined, but we're watching it very closely. And the reason we're watching it very closely is that the FDA right now has the latitude to require clinical data from a 510K. In fact, the only 2 510Ks that we've done out of our 14 companies, we've provided clinical data. We've provided randomized, controlled, blinded clinical data for 510Ks. So it's a misnomer that that doesn't happen. It certainly does, and it can under the current system. What we worry about is how rigorously and how rigidly these other designations might codify that.
Thank you, and I'm going to try to get this last done in my last minute. Dr. Sherman, I understand that you are sending 7 of the most important 510K changes to a panel of the Institute of Medicine. I understand also there are serious questions as to the composition of this panel, and given the role you gave this panel, so I have the following questions. Does this panel have any innovators or inventors?
I do not believe so.
Does this panel have any biomedical engineers or technical experts?
It does.
Could you provide those names to us? Not now. Does this panel have any entrepreneurs and investment and venture capital experts?
Not specifically.
Does this panel have any patient or patient groups who are in need of products currently under the 510K system?
They do have people with connections with the patient community.
And I'd like their names too, because I don't believe you do. How much taxpayer money did you give this IOM panel?
I'll get back to you on the exact figure.
Mr. Hall, do you believe the IOM panel is qualified to make decisions on the 510K?
I think the current members are each individually very talented. I'm concerned that the committee does not have patient representation, does not have representation from entrepreneurs, the people that fund this, industry groups, et cetera. And if you look at other IOM committees, such representation is often there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Chair thanks, gentlemen, and recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Dr. Murphy, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Stern, a couple questions for you. And this relates to some areas of jurisdiction for FDA, and given the limitations of funding and trying to stretch yourself in many ways. I'm looking here on the website. The FDA states it will regulate devices used in the, quote, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease, unquote. I'm curious, if a kit's used by an employer to test or screen for presence of drugs, would that be a mitigate, treat, or prevent a disease category?
Yes, and we've been regulating those devices for about 20 years.
What kind of tests?
These are both laboratory-based tests and point-of-care tests, so tests that are actually used in the workplace.
And are they used to treat or diagnose?
Yeah, if they're not used right, then people actually who should get treatment get missed. People who may have an addiction get missed, and they pose a risk then to the employees, or they get false results and they wind up they're losing their employment.
Do those tests, are they used in such a way that a single test cause them to lose employment, or are they followed up? And in which, if there's a follow-up, is that one that really deals more with the employment issue or the treatment issue?
Well, I was talking about consequences, but what follow-up is done is actually up to the place that's conducting the test, whether or not they do a follow-up or not.
Now, you also have situations, however, that are they used to promote, on the other hand, an orderly workplace environment or to deter drug use?
How it may be used by individual companies, I don't know, but we have regulated it because of the safety concerns that occur when those tests are inaccurate.
When they're inaccurate. What would be an accuracy level that you would consider to be acceptable?
What it comes down to is it actually measuring the drug of abuse or not, and that gets set depending upon the kind of test we have. One of the biggest issues now is with the saliva tests. Mm-hmm. We have one that is point of care for saliva that actually is pretty good. The rest that have come through are actually very poor. They have a very hard time detecting drug.
What's the point of care test is pretty good? Which one is that?
I'll get back to you with the actual name.
Of course, we also know that if one is limited from using these tests, I mean, there's difference in collecting different types of bodily fluid, saliva, urine, blood, etc., and some more invasive in the workplace than others and require more staff time, etc. There's a difference between those who are just a first-level screen, and those are someone is sent on to the next level. You would agree with that, wouldn't you?
Yes, there is a difference between the different tests.
Now, I know that the FDA has threatened to shut down operations for several American manufacturers making these saliva equipment, but not foreign ones. You familiar with that?
We've actually been sending warning letters to a variety of different companies. I will tell you, for the companies now that we have looked at, one of them we actually were two of them we were working with very closely. They had committed to actually get us the data. We held off taking an action for many months to let them get the data that they committed, said, we've got it, we'll get it to you, and then they didn't get it. And some said, oh, yeah, we had data, but it's gone.
My understanding is some of these companies are asking for sufficient time because you're asking for a lot of data basically for them to do clinical trials. Will you work with them and find out if they need additional time, if they are indeed moving forward in that process, or is it closed?
We've actually had been working with them. We gave them lots of time. In fact, we're past the time when, well past the time they were supposed to get back to us. We've had frequent conversations. But for one of them, they actually did make progress, and they sent us the data. For another one, we've actually seen absolutely no meaningful progress.
I understand that part of what the guidelines that were sent to these companies were the guidelines for urine-based tests and not saliva-based tests. Now, we're getting into weeds in this a lot here, too, but part of the understanding that I have of these companies is they're recognized there's really different procedures involved with both of those. I'm sure you'd understand that as well. And I would hope that there'd be some, I mean, from what I understand, they requested fresh guidance in September of last year and wonder when you're going to get them the proper guidance on the saliva-based tests.
Well, we did one better. We've actually been talking with them and walking them through what exactly they need to do because we have experience with these kinds of tests, but they've opted not to follow what we asked them to do.
That's not my understanding, and I hope that we can somehow bridge a communication gap here that you'll work with them. Because, look, none of us want to have drug abuse in the workplace. We're familiar with it, the drug problems, workers' comp problems, injuries, deaths, outside of the workplace, the high risk on all sorts of levels where people operating heavy equipment or dangerous equipment are involved in other things. And along those guidelines, what I understand is there's a number of snags that perhaps it's not reaching your level of some of those communication issues. So I would hope that we could talk offline more directly and see if there can be these problems can be mitigated themselves along those lines.
We'd be happy to come and brief you on what
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Further.
Thank you very much. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair thanks the gentleman and recognizes the Ranking Member Emeritus, gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dingell, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. These questions to Dr. Shuren for yes or no. You're familiar with the cuts being proposed by the majority in the FDA budget, are you not?
Yes, I am.
You're also familiar with the cuts proposed for the Device Center, are you not?
Yes.
All right. Will the cuts in the case of FDA have an impact on the way the Food and Drug can review devices and oversee device safety? Yes or no?
Yes.
Will these affect the amount of time it takes you to review a device application? Yes or no?
Yes.
As you know, this committee will be authorizing the Medical Device User Fee Act next year. Does FDA have the staff it needs to approve the devices in an efficient time frame? Yes or no?
No.
How many does it have?
In the program right now, we have about 1,250 full-time employees, and then we have additional contract support. That's for the entire
How many of those are actually involved in the review and approval of the devices and in overseeing of device safety?
About 72% are involved in what we call the device review process.
How many do you need?
We need a lot more, and much of it will depend upon the kind of program.
I'm asking for a specific number.
It will depend on the program that we put together, and one of the things we'll talk about.
I will submit a letter, and I assume that you will respond, giving me the answer to the questions raised. Does FDA have the user fees it needs now to approve devices in an efficient time frame? Yes or no?
No.
Are there being any diversions in any of the proposals of the budget to divert money from user fees either in prescription pharmaceuticals, over-the-counter pharmaceuticals, or in the case of devices? You can submit that to the record.
We'll submit it.
Would increased user fees help FDA to assure the safety and effectiveness of devices?
Yes.
Yes or no? Would they assist Food and Drug in providing more expeditious service to the people in the industry who have these devices up for approval?
Yes.
Do you believe increased fees are needed to expedite the review process to benefit industry?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I note I have 2 minutes and 10 seconds that I yield back. I will look forward to using it at some later time.
Chair thanks the gentleman and recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie, for 5 minutes.
What happened to Cassidy?
You satisfied?
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. And I was in a second committee of this subcommittee of this committee, so I apologize. I missed some of it, but I get the gist of what we're talking about. And I'm from a manufacturing background, automotive parts, not medical devices, but understand getting products to market and being competitive is important. And I want to go just a little different because I've heard the testimony and some questions I was going to ask have been answered. And it's appropriate in this subcommittee because just the other day we were debating a bill about doctors' conscience, and the minority side brought up an objection to the bill saying if we pass the bill, it's going to raise taxes and put people out of business. And so my question, I think it's appropriate in this committee, even though it's not our jurisdiction, to look at what happened during the health care law. I think those of you who manufacture devices are aware there was a 2.3% tax on revenue, not on income, on revenue, which is an effective tax rate. I don't know. You'd have to recalculate, but far higher than 2.3%. And it goes into effect, and it's $20 billion coming out of the medical device over the next 10 years. It goes into effect in 2013. And even if you're growing your business and trying to sink money back in your business, you're not making a profit, you still pay this tax. It comes off the top. Comes off the top. And I would like just for, particularly Dr. Mako or Mr. Deem or anybody else that's in that is manufacturing, and would you describe how this tax affects large and small device companies and how it affects innovation and job creation? Because there was some concern about our bill last week about what it's going to do to job creation. I'd just like to hear what you think this tax is going to do to job creation.
I'm glad that you asked that question. It's absolutely imperative for small companies that we find a way of modifying that tax proposal, because right now companies that are bringing a new innovative medical product to market need to get to about $70 to $100 million in sales before they see $1 of profit. This means during the entire time, which may be over several years, under the current proposed law, that they would be paying money to the government simply for the privilege of doing business in the United States without earning any profit here. And that means that they would have to raise more money and or cut jobs or reduce other ways of expenditure, research and development, other important things for this country. And so this is, I'm very glad that you brought it up. It's absolutely essential for innovation, especially for medical device technology, that we address this important issue.
Mr. Dean?
I would echo Dr. Macauer's comments. I think this is absolutely going to result in slowed company growth, delayed hiring, and delayed expansion of the company, without a doubt. I mean, just taking that money right off of the top, it's essentially shunting it right out of the operations that company needs to grow.
Are you already hearing, I mean, you've got to be, because you've got to be planning for it. Are you hearing your businesses in your community, the associations that you deal with, how this is affecting them today as they prepare for it in 2013?
We are hearing a lot of discussion about it. My companies actually have been taking so long to get through the regulatory process. Out of the 14, we only have one that's actually selling product right now. But that one actually is planning on trying to figure out what it means to them. Are they going to have to are they going to have to raise more venture capital, which in effect just shunts that straight over to the tax? Are they going to have to try to finance it out of other avenues that will further slow the growth? Nobody really has a good answer for it. The only thing that we are absolutely sure of is that it will slow growth and it will delay job hiring.
My understanding, too, is some states have what they call business privilege taxes. A lot of states who put them in all of a sudden take them off because their businesses move elsewhere. there are probably other people that get off the top revenue taxes. I'm not saying there's not industries that are treated, but I think y'all are especially treated differently than most businesses in this country. And only since the other side brought up the other day that they wanted to work with us to make sure that we had a productive tax code for out of this health care bill. I think this is something, hopefully they're going to stick with us and get this fixed for you guys. Is there any other, I know y'all answered the question. Anybody else want to comment on that? Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm about out of time, so I'll yield back.
Chair, thanks the gentleman. Now in the queue, we have Lance, Cassidy, and Blackman in that order. So the Chair recognizes the gentleman, Mr. Lance, for 5 minutes for question. Then Cassidy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for not being at the entire hearing. There were two subcommittees today meeting at the same time, and since I've been on the full committee for a month, I tried to make both subcommittees, but I certainly appreciate your being with us. To follow up on what Congressman Guthrie has said, Mr. Deem, I represent the district in this country that has more medical device and pharmaceutical employees than any other district anywhere in America. And the medical device excise tax, I think, will be extremely harmful, especially to the district I serve. We like to think we're the medicine chest of the country and perhaps the world. And certainly, I think, moreover, harmful to the nation as a whole. For example, C.R. Bard is one of the 10 largest manufacturers of medical devices. It's located in the district I serve. And I have been told by leadership there that the new 2.3 excise tax will cost that company $45 million a year, which is 25% of that company's research and development budget. This is just one example. There are many across New Jersey and across the nation. Could you explain in a little greater detail, following up on Congressman Guthrie, what you believe this will do to the competitiveness of the industry in this country as it affects the entire world?
Thank you for the question. I agree with the gentlemen and ladies from C.R. Bard. I think that there are only a few places where the larger companies are going to be able to trim that in, trim that money out. And when you look at the large company balance sheets, the R&D line typically involves both R&D and regulatory and clinical. And so if you look at the device tax coming off of R&D, it's hitting them both ways.
And I, of course, believe we should not enact it, that it should be repealed, and I, along with others, we're working on that issue. Do you think that the consequence might occur before the actual implementation of the tax, given the fact that companies will have to begin to calculate what's coming in another year or so?
Absolutely. I haven't worked in the larger companies, but even in the smaller companies, as we look at sales ramps and we look at how quickly we're going to be able to make adjustments, you've got to start planning for it now. So already we're delaying hires and we're looking at how quickly we can grow, and I'm sure that's happening to a much, much larger scale in the larger companies like Bard.
Thank you. Last week, the New York Times reported on a patient who had traveled overseas to receive a medical device that was developed 40 miles from her residence. To any distinguished member of the panel, I would like to think this is an isolated incident, but I'm wondering what the panel's view might be on that.
I'd comment. You know, I actually am grateful to the FDA for doing its job in protecting the safety and effectiveness of my patients and your constituents. And I think that that device, if it had been shown in clinical trials to be safe and effective, would certainly be approved by the FDA. Unfortunately, there are numerous records of devices like that, I believe it was a spinal disc and other ones, that have been approved in Europe and have been subsequently shown to have severe problems. And remember, we are now talking about implantable devices. And so I want to know before the FDA approves a device that before we can even talk about safety, I think the number one goal is effectiveness, because I don't think you or I or anyone want to have something permanently implanted in me that has never been shown to be effective. That does cost money to do a clinical trial to show a device is effective, but I think before we can even start talking about innovation or anything else, I have made a contract to take care of my patients by doing things that will improve their health. If I am going to be put in a position of having to advise them to put in devices that have never been shown to be effective or safe, that is not something I can advise them on. So I think that's fine.
I yield back the 1 second I have left. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks to the gentleman, and recognizes gentleman from Louisiana, Dr. Cassidy, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you. And to whomever I speak to, if I interrupt you, I'm not trying to be rude. We just have 5 minutes. To the two cardiologists, I'm a gastroenterologist, so I approach this with trepidation, okay? But in Dr. Shireen's testimony, he speaks about the necessity to establish effectiveness in the U.S. as versus EU, using the specific example that the manufacturer must show that the laser incises heart tissue and also treats the arrhythmia in the United States, whereas in the EU, you'd only have to show that it incises heart tissue only. But I assume he's talking about some sort of AV node malformation, and frankly, that seems anatomy and physiology. As if you cut that baby, you're going to interrupt the flow of current. That's an electrical current issue. So I'm just tossing that out, not to challenge, frankly, to understand from two cardiologists, does it matter how you cut the AV node?
Yeah, I'd be happy to take that one on. Look, it does matter. And it's not just that it cuts. It's that it cuts the right tissue and doesn't cut something that it shouldn't cut.
Now there's a fairly defined anatomy. Again, I'm a gastroenterologist, so with trepidation I say. It's my understanding there's a fairly defined anatomical pathway. Granted, there's variance, but you know you're going to be a millimeter deep. You're going to be a centimeter wide. Granted, maybe there's scarring with one and not with another, so there's ancillary. But I assume that as commonplace as this has been, particularly at the Cleveland Clinic, that you guys know this.
Yeah. We probably do more of these ablations just about than any place in the country, and there's a complication rate, and these complications are really serious. And before we would
now I don't think but that's a different question than effectiveness, correct?
Well, you know, it's safety and effectiveness can't be taken apart. You know, if you have a device that ablates tissue, but it causes tamponade if it perforates the heart.
Now, but safety and effectiveness are different, because and I thought Mr. Hall's comments were well taken. There's an immediate kind of you do the procedure type complication. There's one further down. Clearly, these guys are not going to approve something which causes a high incidence of tamponade.
I would say, you know, you're talking about ablation, which, as you know, has been approved here as well as in Europe.
And I just use that example because he used it specifically.
The Europeans, you know, just published their 5-year experience and shown that only 25% of all their patients who got the ablation by the guy who invented it are actually free of atrial fibrillation 5 years later. A lot of those patients have had adverse events, including death, as a result. There's a 1% incidence of death reported with that. And so, again,
and that's with the laser?
So it's a great example, because you would think, sure, that's a defined part of tissue, easy to do. People are not that simple, and procedures are never perfect. Every procedure has benefits as well as risks. And unless you do a clinical trial and actually follow those patients to something clinically meaningful, if I burn that piece of tissue and you're dead, you're hardly going to have considered that an effective procedure.
No, I accept that. So what is the normal rate of failure of ablation, however it's done normally, whether it's scalpel or whatever?
The 75% failure at 5 years.
That is with current technology. So
current technology, and that's most people are getting 2 or 3 ablations.
By the way, several people from Baton Rouge have gone to Cleveland Clinic, so I'm going to accept that as a commentary upon those guys.
We do better than most.
Okay. You're at 35%. But,
as is UCSF.
Now, frankly, Dr. Nissen, it looks like Hall's methodology on his paper is superior to yours.
Actually, it's faulty. His denominator, he used all submitted devices. And
now, but may I go back? I was actually looking at, okay, he did the kind of peri-approval period as a high-risk recall.
Yes.
And then he did the late high-risk, which is unrelated, if you will, to the approval process. The approval process is not going to catch the complication 5 years down the road.
It may or may not. It depends on what the mechanism, the complication is. Let me say that we have the same numerator. He has a different denominator. His denominator is all submitted devices, and that's not a realistic denominator. It's actually approved devices. That's the denominator. Let me put it to you this way, Dr. Cassidy. If you have a 99.5% success rate, that sounds very high. But tomorrow when you get on a plane to fly home to Louisiana, the pilot gets on and says, there's a 99.5% chance the plane will take off and land successfully. Would you get off the plane or would you stay on the plane?
I accept that. And I'm almost out of time. It's the only reason I interrupt. Yeah. Mr. Hall, could you respond to Dr. Nissen's discounting of your findings?
Sure. I think the key is to try to identify the reason for the recall so you can try to fix the problem. And if you just look at the numerator, how many, that doesn't tell you whether you have a big problem or a small problem, and most importantly, it doesn't tell you how to fix it. So if you have problems that are not related to the pre-market process, changing the pre-market process is going to be a useless exercise. And the comments earlier about funding, et cetera, I don't like this concept of more or less regulation. I believe in appropriate regulation, and therefore put the dollars where they have the leverage. And that's what my study attempted to do.
I thought that was a very good point. I wish I had more time to ask you all. Thank you for your testimony.
Chair thanks, gentlemen, and recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Dr. Gingrey, for 5 minutes for questions.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I'll get right to the questions. I want to address them primarily to Dr. Makauer. According to a 2009 report by Ernst & Young, access to venture capital by medical technology companies dropped 18% in 2008 due to the United States economic crisis. Dr. Makauer, how important is venture capital to medical device innovation and development?
Venture capital is the lifeblood of innovation in med tech. Absolutely.
A PricewaterhouseCoopers study released last month found that, and I quote them, the innovation ecosystem for medical device technology long centered in the United States is moving offshore, and medical technology innovators are going outside the United States to seek first income. What is first income, Dr. Makauer, and why do companies feel they need to go offshore to get first income?
I think what you're referring to is the approval of origin requirement that many countries are requiring. In other words, many countries will not allow you to sell a product in their country unless you've at least achieved approval in your own country. And the impact of that for U.S. manufacturers is that if we're delayed in getting approvals here, we can't even sell other places in the world unless we move the manufacturing facilities to other countries. And that's why this is so important.
If you'll allow me to interrupt, I think what you're referring to would have been my next question. In fact, I'll talk about it a little bit. Country of origin, requirements. That was not this issue of first revenue, but yeah, you're absolutely right. I think by 2020, the authors of this PricewaterhouseCoopers study predict that China, India, and Brazil will gain significantly in key device measurement areas while the United States will continue to lose ground. And interestingly enough, as you said, these countries also, many countries, not just these, but they have that country of origin requirement that it requires any device manufactured in the United States first be approved for sale in the United States by the FDA before it can be approved for sale in the home market. That's right. So this is what you were referring to in regard to the country of origin.
That's exactly right, and that's the reason why manufacturing plants and high-paid jobs are leaving the country.
These jobs, by the way, that brings up another point. When a medical device company does pick up and move, for whatever reason, I think many of those reasons have been outlined by my colleagues in the questions and certainly by the witnesses. And when they move overseas, what type of jobs are we losing? Are these minimum wage jobs? Are we losing scientists and other highly technical and high-paying jobs to our competitors?
Exactly as you pointed out, they're high-paid jobs. They are scientists. They're engineers. They are the very, very sought-after jobs that are moving.
Well, how do, in fact, anybody can answer this question, but how do EU device regulatory systems compare to the United States? Are the EU regulations more predictable and certain? Why does that matter to a device firm?
It's more transparent. You know what you need to do, and that's why it's more straightforward.
They're also much weaker. They don't require that you demonstrate efficacy, and we think that that's important. That you use a device, you want to know that it's actually going to work, and that's not required in the EU.
And I think, Dr. Sharon, you wanted to respond.
Because in the EU, the public can't, there's no transparency. These are what's cut between the company and the private company. In fact, the European Commission said, and they are re-looking at their system, experience indicates that the current system does not always offer a uniform level of protection of public health in the European Union. New and emerging technologies have challenged the current framework, highlighting gaps and pointing to a certain scarcity of expertise.
Yeah.
Finally,
Dr. Sharon, let me, but I guess cutting right to the chase on that, and I'll ask you specifically, does the EU have more safety problems? You're I think, suggesting that their system is more lax, and that frightens you, but really, statistically, are they having more safety problems?
I think the data that's out there, they're two very different systems. They don't have enough data out there to actually make a firm comparison, but we do have some evidence to show that the U.S. system does provide great value.
Well, I think that is kind of an anecdotal sort of response. And let me just say this to you as I conclude. I want you to know that I appreciate the work that the FDA undertakes for American patients. I'm a physician, too, an OBGYN doctor. But I do believe that if we don't undertake an immediate and very, very critical review of the FDA regulatory process, trying to identify safe and effective ways to improve the transparency and consistency of the approval process, irreversible damage to the United States-based medical innovation will result. And, you know, we're in a situation where we need jobs. We need them desperately. I realize that the balance is hugely important. But we need to smooth and streamline this process and not keep changing the bar. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence, and I'll yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you all for being here. My district in Tennessee includes a city you all probably know a little bit about, Memphis. And as you know, we're probably the number 2 when it comes to device implementation, creation, and with our companies that are there that are doing tremendous work in R&D, with patent holders, with the biotech R&D that's being done in the mid part of Tennessee, the other end of my district, we hear a lot about the FDA and the problems that exist with the FDA. And we're focused on this because we think that in the 21st century, when you look at the creative economy as it exists and look at jobs creation and jobs retention, that we have to make certain we're protecting the intellectual property of these innovators and creating the environment that they can innovate here, but also that they can manufacture here. And Mr. Makower, I know we've talked about your study and everyone is focused on this in our questioning, but I think it is such an imperative that we create the environment that our companies and our innovators can handle that jobs growth. And I liked what you did when you analyzed the FDA's impact on medical technology innovation and comparing the EU and the U.S., the time and the cost and lack of predictability. But what I'd like to do is we look at jobs. 400,000 Americans and over 2 million jobs that are created through this industry. Where is the FDA causing us problems and hindering on that? What other countries around the world specifically, especially in Europe, are trying to take our jobs? Who is trying to compete with us on this environment? How do we reach that standard so that we're responsible to consumers, but we are not hampering innovation? So quickly, if you will hit what you think our problems at the FDA are and how they get in the way of those job creation numbers that we're wanting to see and the environment for jobs growth to take place. And then I'm going to let any of the others of you weigh in also.
The fundamental things that I think, the themes that we've been talking about are predictability, reasonability, transparency. Those are the things that allow the process to happen, because when you go to raise money as a small entrepreneur, you can set out a path. You know what's expected. And when you have that
and you
initial,
see the FDA as a hindrance to
but
those.
right now, that's a problem.
Okay.
In other countries, it's clear. It's clear what you need to do, and it does not take as much time, and you can get
Compare to me, if I were to take an implement for a hip to the FDA, in the U.S., the time to get it through the FDA would be what, and in Europe, it would be what?
It's a specific example, and I don't want to misstate what the times would be for that. So I would get back to you on the exact numbers.
That would be great. I think it would be helpful to us because we're looking 10, 20 years down the road, and we're concerned about what would happen with the medical device implementation industry here in this country. It's a lot of jobs for us in Tennessee. Anybody else want to weigh in on the problems with the FDA or how they see the FDA as an impediment to jobs retention and jobs growth?
I think that one of the things that has it's been touched on from time to time, but that deserves significant thought is the risk-benefit ratio, and that's always been a concern, and that's clearly the most difficult job that the agency has, is determining where is the appropriate balance between risk and benefit. And I think if we look over the last several years and look at the delays that have increased and the inconsistency that's crept in, I think it has a lot to do with what is our expectation of risk and benefit. So I think that is an area that we as a people should look at as well.
Do any of you know of specific firms that have chosen to move offshore for their manufacturing? Could you provide those examples?
Yep, it's not one of my companies, but there's a company named Biosensors, which is a worldwide stent company. They had a headquarter it was either Irvine or San Diego. They were being held back from expanding into international markets that they wanted to go to by the country of origin laws. And just within the last year, they ceased all U.S. operations and moved the
And how many
operations
jobs
overseas.
was that, and how much, on average, do they pay?
I would have to get back to you on the specific number of jobs since it wasn't my company, but the average pays for the types of manufacturing that we're talking about can be in the 40, 50,000. It's very high-paid manufacturing. And then when you start to look at the engineers that are involved, you're in the $100,000, $150,000 jobs. So these are very, very highly sought-after, high-paid jobs.
Excellent. Thank you. I yield back.
Did any of the other witnesses wish to respond to that question? Dr. Redberg.
I just wanted to point out the other side of the money that we spend in the over $100 billion on devices is that when we are approving devices that haven't been shown to be of benefit for your constituents and our patients, that means we're spending billions of dollars. Technology is the #1 driver of healthcare costs, and a reason that a lot of jobs are having issues in employments and state governments are because of they cannot sustain the cost of healthcare premiums. And so I would just consider the other side of allowing untested, expensive new technology of no known benefit, definite risks, is also driving up healthcare premiums and driving businesses to close because they cannot afford to pay for the healthcare for their workers.
All right. Dr. Shuren.
And I think it's also important to recognize, and we know we have a role to play, and I've mentioned there are actions that we are taking, but this is far more complicated. Even AdvaMed has talked about the health of the medical device industry, and I don't want to put things down, but we went through the biggest recession since the Great Depression. It has affected everyone. But in the medical device industry, they changed their business models. They became more risk-averse. The venture capitalists have decided we're not going to invest so much in the early stage innovative technologies. We want to see this more fully developed. They raised the bar on their own industry. I don't think the answer to this is that we change the American standard that we've had in place that has served the country very well. We agree that we need to have the right balance between facilitating innovation and assuring that devices are safe and effective. We're stepping up to the plate for the things we need to do. If this is really going to happen, we need industry to do the other part of it. And we also do need to have the people to do the job right. Even industry has said, and Josh has said, we have high turnover. They find that that affects reviews, and we agree. But the problem is we don't have the people for doing over the work. Their workload is overloaded. And we need to address that. If we're really going to make this right, we have to invest. We've got to invest in the FDA. If we want to be competitive for industry, we need to be competitive about the FDA brand.
Thank you. Any other witnesses? I wanted to respond to that question.
Just one thing. There seems to be a belief there's a yes, no, or binary aspect to the 510K system I want to clear up. The agency has the authority to obtain clinical data under the 510K system. They have the statutory authority. They have the regulatory authority in cases in which they think that that's necessary or appropriate to make safety and efficacy determinations. So they have that authority right now, and probably 10 to 15% of submissions include clinical data of some sort.
Chair thanks the witnesses.
Mr. Chairman, just unanimous consent, just to ask one follow-up question.
Without objection.
He's distracted, so he's not able to object. Dr. Shuren, I just wanted to point out that last summer when Dr. Sharfstein was here, we had a hearing on bottlenecks in the pipeline. And I asked a question because I was concerned. We gave $10 billion to the NIH as a stimulus. Well, we gave it. I voted against that. But Congress gave that $10 billion to the NIH. And I asked Dr. Sharfstein, is this going to be a problem as all this new stuff from NIH starts coming down the pipeline? Is FDA, what are you going to do? And he was dismissive and said that they had all of the money that they needed. This past summer with the hearing on the DeCoster egg farms with the salmonella that appeared in the eggs, and it appeared that in the food safety aspect, which I know is not your jurisdiction, but it appeared that some very basic processes were not followed, and communication between FDA and USDA really suffered, and he told me once again that funding was not the issue, it was a process. So I just wanted to make those points because I have asked at the highest levels of the FDA, are we giving you the tools that you need given the fact of everything else that's going on around you, and was told twice by the second in command at your agency that that in fact was not an issue. I recognize he's no longer the second in command at your agency.
And I don't know what he was said. I will tell you that now for the first time in fiscal year 2010, the FDA, which is a lean agency, for the very first time exceeded its FTE counts, its full-time employees that we had on board 18 years ago in 1992. Just was coming up to speed then. And in the interim, medical devices have become significantly more complex and challenging. If we honestly want to remain the innovators, the world's innovators, we have to address all the issues. When FDA approves a product, other countries listen. You can get a CE mark, and I talk to my folks over there, and there's slow uptake on the new technologies because they don't have full confidence in the CE mark. Some will use it, a lot won't. But when the FDA approves a device, not only is there rapid uptake here in the U.S., other countries take notice, and the physicians over there start to use it. We need to invest in the FDA. It is so critical that we are working well because it ultimately helps them, and it helps patients. And as a physician, I care a lot about that.
As do I. And just the last thing, you made a comment that industry just won't talk to the FDA. Again, you do have industry there, Mr. Dean, Mr. Maycower. You have a chance now to talk to the FDA. They're right there. So maybe you guys could just visit a little bit and get some of these things hashed out.
Okay. Dr. Burgess, would you yield to Mr. Pallone?
Absolutely.
I just wanted to, I know we haven't had a chance to ask many questions on this side. Dr. Shuren and Dr. Redberg, there was a lot of discussion on the study release this week, about the Dr. Nissen, I said? I'm sorry, Dr. Nissen and Dr. Redberg. There was a lot of discussion about this study release this week about, recalled products under 510K. I'm not sure you had a chance to respond to that, if you would. It would just give you some time to do that.
What I want to say is that there's a serious problem here. 112 million devices were withdrawn over a 5-year period of time, more than 2,000 deaths a year due to device failures, and more than 100,000 injuries. That's serious, and it needs to be looked at very carefully. And so keeping that balance between safety and rapid and speedy approval is really critical. And what I'm arguing for is not to make things tough on industry. It's to make things safe for patients, putting patients first. We have a motto in medicine, primum non nocere. In Latin, it means above all, do no harm. And a device that has to be withdrawn, taken out of a patient's body, whether it be a spinal disc or something else, is very serious. And the final thing I wanted to say, I didn't quite get a chance with Dr. Cassidy's question, is this idea that there's a 99.5% success rate for 510K. And here's what I want you all to think about when you go home on Friday night. You get on the plane, and a pilot comes on and says, there's a 99.5% chance that this plane will take off and land safely. Is that good enough, or is it not good enough? And I don't think it's good enough, and I think we can do better.
I'd like to... I would like to also point out that recalls, while they're important, they're not a way to gauge safety of medical devices. You know, recalls are the tip of the iceberg. Because of our adverse event reporting system, it's estimated that we only know about 1 or 2% of all serious adverse events that occur. And so, you know, while recalls are an extreme example, because a device hasn't been recalled is not an assurance of safety, and more importantly, it's not an assurance of effectiveness. So again, the FDA's primary mission, while encouraging innovation, is important, but not to encourage innovation at the price of ignoring safety and effectiveness. And the only way to know a device that I am going to put in your body is safe and effective is to study it in clinical trials in humans with meaningful endpoints, real outcomes, and reasonable follow-up, and continue post-marketing surveillance so that those rare adverse events can be reported. We have a long way to go to get to that goal.
I think it's clear that everybody is interested in safety. If you want safety, you need to understand the reasons why the problem occurred. And the majority of those recalls occurred because of after-approval issues, not because of the pre-market system. And I believe in targeted or focused regulation. And if you go to the 99.5, would you get on an airplane? With that analogy, you'd never go to the hospital. Because the hospital rates of problems are much greater. 2.3% of Medicare patients have a safety issue in the hospital. 15% of elders get a misprescription. We all need to do better.
Yeah. Excellent testimony. I don't want to cut you off. Did you want to have something to say, Dr. Scher?
Well, all I would say is we take the safety concerns very seriously, and in fact, the data shows that there are problems that are occurring that could be addressed pre-market. We've tried to address some of this in the actions we're taking. There are times when targeted manufacturing data for certain products can help us identify problems beforehand, and in some cases doing a pre-clearance inspection. I will say if much of the debate is going to be on quality systems, I would note in the EU you have the auditors, you have the third parties that go in and they look at the companies who are actually going to bring a product on the market. Here in the U.S., the law sets a very high bar for us to do that. If we're going to look at quality systems and put more of an emphasis, then we should sort of revisit that framework. And last, I'd say there are times when clinical data can actually identify safety problems with infusion pumps. It's exactly what we're going to impose on the manufacturers, and we're starting to do it.
All right, thank you. In conclusion, I'd like to thank all of the witnesses and the members that participated in today's hearing, and I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record, and I ask that the witnesses all agree to respond promptly to the questions. As this Monday is President's Day, members should submit their questions by the close of business on March 4th. The subcommittee is adjourned.